Welcome back to Bandwagon fans. I'm Jeff, and before I get started, I just want to send a shout out to my subscribers. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for subscribing, and hopefully you'll enjoy the content and these reviews I'm providing. And as I go forward, I'll keep trying to work in my anthropological point of view into these movie reviews and discussions, and hopefully I'll be able to add a couple insights that maybe some other people don't have. We're all watching the same movies, we're all talking about the same things, but hopefully I'll strive to put a different spin on it than you're getting in most other reviews. So with that being said, tonight's next movie is The Death of Stalin. This is a 2017 movie directed by Orlando Iannucci, based off of the French novel La Mort de Stalin. And this chronicles the struggle for power in the days after the death of Joseph Stalin. No spoiler there, it's in the title. Pretty interesting movie, and here's a couple highlights from the trailers.
I propose we call a doctor.
All the best doctors are dead.
I can't remember who's alive and who isn't.
It's Comrade Stalin.
I'll take it from here. We need to start putting together a plan.
How can you run and plot at the same time?
We should get Stalin's children here.
What are you doing to my father, you jackals? How old are you?
I'm old.
You're not old! You're not even a person! You're a testicle!
Everything's gonna be fine.
This is not exactly fine, is it? My father's lying there with his head open.
Stalin would have wanted the committee as one.
All those in favor? Carried unanimously.
Rooshed, not rooshed.
Whatever.
Not rooshed. Rooshed?
Would you stop with this? I want to make a speech at my father's funeral.
No problem.
Technically, yes, but practically.
When I said no problem, what I meant was no problem. Ignore me.
Oh my God. All right, so The Death of Stalin, and I got Ernie running behind me. You might see a porg disappearing here in a minute. If you saw my acrimony review, you know that Ernie is a big fan of the porg. Oh, he's just gonna chill. He's right off camera here, but he's just kind of chilling. You'll see his little tail here. What are you doing there? All right, The Death of Stalin. So this stars Steve Buscemi as Nikita Khrushchev, Jeffrey Tambor as Georgy Malenkov, and Simon Russell Beale as Laurenti Beria. So this is a historical dark comedy following, we're introduced to Joseph Stalin. Pretty much the entire movie takes place within the confines of I think the Politburo or Stalin's home. But early on in the movie, Joseph Stalin dies, no surprise there. And then it turns into and you have this struggle for power, primarily between Khrushchev, Beria, and Malenkov. And as different factions form within this very tight-knit group, and there's a lot of opportunity for comedy within the movie. Overall, I really enjoyed this movie. This is a dark comedy, and when it wanted to go dark, it went really dark. And when it wanted to be funny, it was pretty funny. Steve Buscemi is one of the finest character actors around. His performance in this was top-notch, as really all the performances were top-notch. The writing was incredibly sharp. The movie was paced incredibly well. It was brisk. It kept your attention going. And it took about 9 months worth of events and kind of cut it down into what felt like a few days of on-screen action. So I did a little bit of fact checking after I saw this movie, which I usually do if I watch any kind of a historical movie, and they did a pretty good job of getting the essence of the events that happened after Stalin died, without being, it wasn't a literal XYZ. It was, you talk about things that happened, well, without getting into spoilers, things happened over a period of 9 months, whereas in the movie they condensed it down. And making that choice to make everything seem like it happened within a few days gives the movie, gives the events in the movie, excuse me, a kind of energy, a kind of frenetic pacing that really heightened the irony and the humor in the movie. There was some really macabre scenes and some really nice moments of irony where you have the most powerful men in Soviet Union, and for the matter of some of the most powerful men in the world, and they're making life and death decisions in their pajamas, kneeling in a puddle of urine. And just those little moments of contrasting the consequences of these men's decisions versus the absurdity of who these men were really really added to the humor. But then when it wanted to get dark, you saw just how brutal these people could be. And keep in mind, for the Soviet Union around World War II and the years leading up to World War II and after, this is one of the most brutal regimes in the history of humanity. Tens of millions of people were ultimately killed in various purges, military, doctors, academics. We kind of overlook the history of the Soviet Union, at least at that period, but it was far more brutal than even the Nazi regime in terms of the numbers. And Ernie's just going crazy over here, but you guys can't see him. Overall, really enjoyable movie. I highly recommend it. It probably has a very specific audience, people that are interested in politics, people that are interested in history. Definitely should go see this. But even if you don't think that that's your cup of tea, I would still strongly suggest you give this movie a try. It is incredibly funny. It's incredibly well acted. Really some interesting cinematography in terms of the shot composition. When you think of the Soviet Union and you think of these monolithic buildings, these big, huge, powerful pillars and block style architecture, some of the cinematography really heightened that aspect of it and really added to the weight of what was being dramatized. So overall, just highly recommend this movie. I'll give it, 4.25 stars out of 5. So for those of you that have seen it, leave your comments below what you thought of it. And if you haven't seen it, like I said, go check it out. This is a movie that really deserves to be seen, and it's entertaining and in its own way educational. So with that being said, I'm gonna fade out for a minute and then come right back and talk spoilers and talk a little bit about where I see this movie fitting into our current political cultural milieu. So fade out, and here's the fade in. So from here on out, there is going to be some spoilers. However, you could get all the spoilers from the Wikipedia article. All the history in the movie was accurate in terms of who died and who ultimately prevailed. So after Stalin's death, the three main people that were portrayed in the movie, one was Georgy Malenkov, who was initially the initial successor. And then you have Nikita Khrushchev, who most of us should remember from history, ultimately became the premier of the Soviet Union for almost a decade. But in the meantime, there was another guy, Lavrentiy Beria, who was really positioning himself to take over after Stalin's death. And he was the head of I think it was the NKPD, which is basically what was at the time the Soviet Union's secret police. And this guy, in the movie, they show him just how ruthless he was. And there goes the porg. So as soon as Stalin, there was a moment where it wasn't certain if Stalin was going to die or not. And he was vacillating between showing absolute despair over Stalin dying versus uncontrolled glee of the coming struggle. And that's actually, from what I could tell, historically accurate. There was a scene where as Stalin is dying, or I think right after he dies, Berea leans in and says something. He says something to him, which Khrushchev overhears, and it really turns into. I'll mention the three people, but it's really a battle between Khrushchev and Berea. Molotov was kind of a pawn between them, and I don't know much. I didn't really look into him too much, see what the history behind Molotov was. In the movie, he's really shown as a buffoon. He's shown as being really weak-willed. It's played by Jeffrey Tambor, who does this kind of character well, but just showed as being really weak and easily manipulated by Khrushchev and Berea. And that's kind of hard to believe that that's historically accurate. Anybody who would rise to be the second most powerful person in the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin cannot be that easily manipulated. This is somebody that has to have a pretty strong spine to survive in that environment. So the decision to condense all these events and to make this a comedy, the benefit of that is you get to show just how absurd it was. And there's moments where, they spend a lot of time when they're in committee. It would show them going into committee and having votes within their committee. And it was really important that all the votes were unanimous. Even if somebody kind of disagreed, they would still raise their hand and vote so that they could mark it off as unanimous. And that's to show solidarity to the Soviet people. Even though we know they're actually getting ready and literally plotting each other's deaths, they have to show solidarity. And it's also, there's that absurdity of what was being said amongst themselves versus the subtext. And, you absolutely had to be an orthodox thinker, even while they were plotting to forge a new government. Hey, what are you doing? What are you doing? So by making a comedy, they got to really kind of highlight that absurdity. Now, the downside of making a comedy is, like I've said before, these are some of the worst monsters in the history of humanity. There's a scene, so spoiler alert, this whole thing is spoiler discussion now. Ultimately, Khrushchev wins the power struggle. Berea looks like he's poised to take control, but Khrushchev is able to manipulate the committee, and they end up charging Berea with treason and some other crimes, and he ends up getting executed after a show trial, and that's pretty much how the movie ends. In real life, he was charged for treason and espionage and terrorism, and was ultimately executed a few months later. And in the movie, during the show trial, they briefly mentioned that he raped some women, some as young as 14. And in the context of the scene in the movie, it made it sound like they were just making up charges to convict him of something. Well, after a little bit of reading, it wasn't made up. Berea was an absolute monster who would drive through Moscow, point out a woman, and then she would be taken and basically kidnapped, and he would rape her, this is just so horrific. His secretary would give the woman flowers as she was leaving his office, and that would be signifying that she had consented. And if she tried to resist or say she didn't consent, she would be arrested and probably executed. His home is now, and I forget what country it is, but is now an embassy. And about 10, 15 years ago, I think, fairly recently, they found the remains of several women buried at this embassy, which used to be this guy's house. So, point being, turning this movie into a comedy kind of downplayed just how horrific these people were, and just how horrific the conditions for people in the Soviet Union were at this time. So, again, when you're making a movie, you have to make choices it's a balancing act. That this is the consequence of making this into a comedy. So when we were doing our discussion of Red Sparrow, I mentioned I predicted that you're going to see a lot more movies coming out with Russia as an antagonist. And if you grew up like me, I grew up in the 80s, and everything I knew about Russia or the Soviet Union was Rocky IV, First Blood, or Rambo First Blood Part 3, G.I. Joe, with the October Guard. Everything we learned about the Soviet Union was through movies, and it was a caricature of an evil empire. We didn't really get a sense of. It was hard to get a real sense of what life was like in Russia. So this was an interesting movie because it pulled back the Iron Curtain and gave us an opportunity to see what was going on inside, but but I'm not entirely certain if it was an accurate depiction or not. It distilled some of the facts down, and I think it got the essence of it, but I don't know if it was a good depiction of what was. It tried to show how horrific it was for people to live under that regime. I don't know how accurate that was. We kind of have this idea that everybody in the Soviet Union was constantly fearing for their life, and maybe that's accurate, I don't know. But I kind of doubt that it was as grim on a daily basis as they made it sound like. But like I said, we never know. It kind of makes me want to go back and learn the history a little bit more, so it's always good when a movie kind of prods you to want to know more about its subject. And for those of you that have seen the movie, what did you think of it? Go ahead and leave a comment below. And as always, I'm Jeff. This is Bandwagon Fans. Like and subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with all our upcoming reviews, and get on the bandwagon.